The rain came down on Chicago like it had a grudge, and Nora Bennett stood at the altar in a dress the color of dry blood, waiting to marry the man the entire city swore had put a bullet in her brother. 600 guests held one long, poison breath. The priest asked if anyone present knew a reason these two should not be joined, and somewhere near the back a champagne flute snapped in a closed fist. Nora lifted her chin and looked up into the calm, unhurried eyes of Damiano Vitale. And she smiled at him the way a bride is supposed to smile. "Say the vow," she told herself, over the roar of her own pulse. "Say it, and get close enough to put him in the ground the way he put Thomas there." 3 months earlier, Nora had not owned a dress worth ruining. She had owned 2 skirts that fit, one that almost fit, and a pair of shoes she resoled herself with a tube of glue from the corner pharmacy. She kept the books for Thorne & Associates, a mid-tier accounting firm on the 14th floor of a building that smelled of burnt coffee and other people's money, and she was very good at it, which was precisely why no one there ever looked at her twice. Numbers behave for Nora, people did not. She was the woman who noticed the $7 discrepancy that turned out to be a $70,000 fraud, and she was also the woman whose name Gerald Thorne could never quite remember calling her you and sweetheart, and once, when he was drunk at the holiday party and thought it was funny, the big girl who does the spreadsheets. She carried more of herself than the women in the glossy ads, and the city never let her forget it. She had learned young how to make herself smaller in a doorway, how to angle her shoulders past a crowd, how to laugh first at the joke so it couldn't be aimed at her. What the city did not know was that under all that practiced apology there was a spine of cold iron, and it had been forged the night the police came to her mother's door. Her brother, Thomas Bennett, had run a small freight and shipping outfit down by the river. Nothing grand. 3 trucks in a warehouse and a stubborn honesty that everyone told him would sink him. He had borrowed money to keep it afloat. He had borrowed it, Nora would later learn, from the Vitale family, because in Chicago there was no clean money left to borrow, and Thomas had been too proud to tell her how far under he was. Then one wet November night, Thomas had gone to the warehouse to meet someone, and by morning he was a chalk outline and a headline. Freight operator, slain in suspected mob dispute. The gun was never found. The witnesses developed a talent for silence, but the whole city knew, the way the city always knows, things it can never quite prove, that Thomas Bennett had owed the Vitales, and that men who owed the Vitales and could not pay tended to become chalk outlines. The name that moved through every whispered account, the name the reporters printed with careful legal hedging, was Damiano Vitale. So Nora buried her brother in the frozen ground with 11 mourners and a mother who could no longer stand without help. And she went home to a stack of medical bills that climbed toward the ceiling. Margaret Bennett's heart was failing by inches, and the specialist who could slow it wanted more money than Nora would earn in a decade of spreadsheets. Thomas had been the one holding them all up. Now Thomas was gone, and the man who had ordered it. Everyone agreed on this. Everyone was untouchable, sleeping in a mansion on the lake behind stone walls and armed men, sipping his good wine while the Bennett family drowned. Nora did not weep at the funeral. She had done all her weeping in the shower where no one could hear. What she did instead was open a fresh ledger, the kind she'd used since she was 19, and at the top of the first blank page she wrote a single word in her small, exact hand. Damiano. Under it she began, methodically, to build a case no court would ever hear. She was still building it the afternoon Gerald Thorne fired her. It happened in front of the whole floor, which was how Gerald did everything, because an audience made him feel taller. A client's account had gone sideways. Money moved without paper, a shell company nobody could name. And Gerald needed a body to lay it on, and the safest body in the room was the one no one would defend. He stood over her desk with his tie loosened and his voice pitched to carry. He said the firm needed people who fit the brand. He said clients wanted sharp, and he let his eyes drag down over her in a way that finished the sentence for him. He said maybe she'd be happier somewhere with a more relaxed dress code, and the junior associates laughed, the small, ugly laugh of people relieved it wasn't them. Nora packed her ledger and her one photo of Thomas into a paper box, and she did not give Gerald the trembling lip he was hunting for. She only looked at him for a moment too long, long enough that his smirk faltered, and then she walked out into the rain. That night she learned 3 things by lamplight and by the cold blue glow of her laptop. First, that the phantom money in the client account she'd been blamed for had been routed in its final hop before it vanished, through a holding company in the Cayman registry. Second, that the same holding company had, 18 months prior, held the paper on a freight loan to a small shipping outfit down by the river. Third, that the signature authorizing that loan had not, as the world believed, come from the Vitale family at all. It had come through a man named Cesare Bruno. Nora did not know yet what that meant. She only knew that a thread had come loose, and she was a woman who could not leave a loose thread alone. The invitation came a week later, cream cardstock with a gold rule, delivered by a driver in a black coat who waited by his car while she read it. A charity gala at the Vitale estate. The family's annual show of civic virtue. The one night a year they let photographers pass the gates so the newspapers could print the word philanthropist next to the word Vitale and pretend the two belonged in the same sentence. Nora had not been invited. Grace Molina had. Grace, her one friend from the old firm, who catered such things now and needed an extra pair of steady hands for the coat check. "Come work it with me," Grace had said. "You'll make 200 cash and you'll get to see how the other half poisons itself." Nora had almost said no. Then she'd remembered the name at the top of her ledger, and she'd said yes because the man who owed her brother's blood would be under that roof, and Nora Bennett wanted to see his face in a room she was standing in. She wore the almost fitting skirt and a blouse she pressed twice. Grace lent her a coat that hung right, and for 1 hour from behind the coat check counter, Nora watched the aristocracy of Chicago's shadows drink champagne under chandeliers the size of small cars, and she found she could not stop watching one man in particular. Damiano Vitale did not move like the others. The others performed themselves, laughing too loud, gripping too hard, glancing about to be sure they were being seen. Damiano stood near the tall windows, with a glass he never seemed to drink from, and the room bent toward him without touching him, the way water bends around a stone. He was younger than she'd expected, and more still. Dark suit, dark eyes, a face that gave nothing away and asked for nothing back. When he spoke to someone, they leaned in. When he stopped speaking, they stayed leaning, waiting. He was the quietest thing in a loud room, and somehow that made him the only thing you could hear. That, thought Nora, with a hatred so pure it felt almost like clarity, is the man who killed my brother. And then Camilla Ashford found her at the coat check, and the evening changed its shape. Camilla was old Chicago money, gone thin and sharp, a woman who had spent 40 years being told she was beautiful and had come to require it the way other people require air. She wanted Damiano. Everyone at the gala understood this. Understood that Camilla circled him each year with a patience that was starting to fray. She swept up to the counter in a column of silver silk, dropped her wrap on the wood without looking, and only then registered the woman behind it. Her gaze traveled up Nora and back down, unhurried, appraising, and whatever she saw amused her. "Oh," Camilla said, loud enough for the little cluster of guests behind her. "They really will hire anyone to hold the coats now. I suppose it takes someone sturdy." A pause, perfectly weighted, a smile that never reached her eyes. "Do try not to eat the canapes, darling. There's a whole table of people who actually paid to be here." The little cluster laughed. Nora felt the old heat climb her throat, the reflex to shrink, to fold the shoulders, to make of herself a smaller target. She had lived inside that reflex her whole life. She did not fold. She looked Camilla Ashford full in the face, and she said in a voice as even as a closed ledger, "I'll hold your coat, Mrs. Ashford. Given how the evening's going, I imagine someone should hold on to something of yours before the night's over." It was not a scream. It was not a scene. It was one quiet sentence, delivered without a tremor, and it landed like a slap because Camilla was not accustomed to being answered at all. Her powdered face went blotched and rigid. She opened her mouth, and the room in that strange animal way rooms have went still. Not all at once, but in a spreading hush, heads turning, because a large dark presence had crossed the floor and come to a stop 3 feet from the coat check counter, and the presence was Damiano Vitale. He had not raised his voice. He had not raised anything. He simply stood there in his stillness, looking at Camilla Ashford with an expression of mild, terrible patience, and every conversation within earshot died of natural causes. "Camilla," he said. "Just the name." He let it sit. "Damiano." Her recovery was fast, practiced, a lifetime of it. "I was only. You were leaving." He said it gently, which was somehow worse than if he'd shouted. "Enzo will bring your car around." His eyes moved, unhurried, to a broad-shouldered man near the door who inclined his head. Then Damiano turned that flat, dark gaze back to Camilla, and for one held second Nora watched a genuinely frightening thing move behind his calm. Not anger, nothing so hot as anger, but a cold cataloging. A man writing something down in a place from which it would never be erased. "You'll want to be more careful," he told Camilla, "whose evening you decide to ruin. You never know who they belong to." Camilla left. She did not get her coat. Then Damiano Vitale looked at Nora Bennett for the first time, and Nora looked back, and she thought, with a lurch of vertigo, "He has no idea who I am. He killed my brother, and he doesn't even know my face." "What's your name?" he asked. "Nora," she said. She did not give him the second half. Not yet. Something flickered in him. Not recognition, but interest. The interest of a man who spends his life among people who flinch and has just met one who didn't. "That was a good line," he said. The coat. The ghost of something that in another man might have been a smile. "You weren't afraid of her." "I've been afraid of worse things than Camilla Ashford," Nora said, and held his eyes as she said it, and let him make of that whatever he liked. He studied her a moment longer. Then he inclined his head, the barest courtesy, and moved back into the current of the room. But as he went, he said something low to the broad-shouldered man, Enzo, and Enzo glanced back at the coat check, at Nora, with new and careful attention. She had been noticed. In that world, she would come to learn. Being noticed was the most dangerous thing that could happen to a person. She should have run. Instead, she went home and added a line to her ledger, and the line was, "He looks you in the eye when he lies to the world." Remember that. Enzo Marchetti came to her mother's apartment 2 days later. He came alone, in a good coat, and he stood in the narrow hall with his hat in his hands like a man raised to be polite to widows, and he told Nora that Mr. Tom Vitale wished to discuss the matter of her late brother's debt. Nora's blood went cold and then hot. So this was how it would go. The family come to collect from the corpse's kin, to squeeze the last drops from a dead man's people. She let Enzo in, because refusing men like Enzo was not a thing that was done. And she sat him at the kitchen table across from the stack of medical bills she had not managed to hide. Enzo looked at the bills. He looked at Margaret Bennett asleep and gray in the next room, with the oxygen line at her nose. He looked at Nora. And when he spoke, there was something in his blunt face she had not expected, something that was almost like respect. "Your brother's loan sits at 400,000, Enzo said. "With what's accrued." He set a folder on the table but didn't open it. "Mr. Vitale is prepared to forgive it. All of it, and to cover the arrangement for your mother's care. The specialist, the surgery she needs, the whole of it." He paused, in exchange for one thing. "Nothing's free," Nora said. "Especially not from you." "No," Enzo agreed. "It isn't." He turned the folder a quarter-inch toward her, still closed. "The Bruno family has taken an interest in your brother's outfit. In the warehouse, the river access, the routes. They believe there's something in what Thomas left behind that belongs to them, and they are not gentle people when they believe a thing is theirs. 2 nights ago, men who work for Cesare Bruno were watching this building. He let that land. Mr. Vitale would like to marry you." The kitchen tap dripped into the sink. Nora heard her own breath. "Marry me," she repeated. "A marriage puts you under the family's protection in a way nothing else does," Enzo said. "The Brunos can circle a bookkeeper. They cannot touch a Vitale wife, not without starting a war they aren't ready to lose. The debt clears. Your mother is cared for, fully, for as long as she lives, and you are safe. He looked at his hat. It is not a small thing he's offering, and I'll tell you plainly, because you strike me as a woman who prefers it plain. I don't know why he's offering it. He doesn't make offers like this, not to anyone. Nora sat very still, and inside her a great cold machine began, quietly, to turn. Here was the man the whole world said had murdered Thomas, extending his hand across her brother's grave to offer her his name and his protection and his money, and asking in return that she stand at an altar and become his. Every cell in her body wanted to spit in his face, but the ledger in her mind was already running the numbers a different way. The way it always did. The way that saw $7 and found 70,000. A wife lived in his house. A wife heard his phone calls, read his mail, learned the rhythm of his men, moved through the rooms where his secrets were kept. A wife could hold a man's whole world in her hands, and he would never think to lock the door. She had spent 3 months building a case against Damiano Vitale from the outside, with public records and a bookkeeper's stubbornness, and she had a loose thread in a name. Cesare Bruno, and no way inside the walls. Now the walls were opening. Now the man himself was inviting her in. Get close enough, she thought. Get close enough to bury him and save your mother while you do it. Tell Mr. End, Vitale, Nora said, and her voice did not shake, that I accept. Enzo Marchetti looked at her for a long moment with something that might have been pity or might have been warning. Then he stood and put on his hat and said, "He'll want to meet you properly, tomorrow. And Miss Bennett." He stopped at the door. "Whatever you think you know about him, it's smaller than the truth. It always is." She did not know then how right he was. Damiano did not court her. He was not a man built for it. What he did in the strange weeks that followed was watch her, and let himself, by fractions, be watched in return. He moved her and her mother into a wing of the estate, where the medical equipment appeared before she asked and the specialist arrived without a bill. He did not touch her. He sat across long dinners and asked her spare exact questions and listened to the answers with a completeness that unnerved her, because no one had ever listened to Nora Bennett as though her words were worth the whole of a man's attention. She kept her guard up like a raised drawbridge. She reminded herself, nightly in the mirror, he killed Thomas. Whatever this is, it is a mask. And under the mask is the man who left your brother on a warehouse floor. But the mask did not slip the way a mask should. It did something else. It thinned. There was the night she found him in the dark of his study, with a glass he wasn't drinking, staring at nothing, and he told her, unprompted, in a low, flat voice, as if the dark had loosened something, about his father who had built the family on fear and taught his son that a man who is loved is a man with a soft place to be knifed. There was the way his men, hard men, blunt instruments like Vince Ricci went quiet and careful around him, not out of terror but out of something closer to devotion, the loyalty men give to a leader who has bled for them. There was old Salvatore Conti, the consigliere, ancient and dry as paper, who took Nora aside at that first family dinner and said, watching Damiano across the room, "He has not slept properly in a year, not since," and then stopped himself and would say no more, and left her wondering, not since what? And there was Fabian Cross. Damiano hired the stylist for the wedding, and Fabian arrived in a cloud of scarves and opinions and swatches, and within 10 minutes of looking at Nora, he was suggesting with the gentle cruelty of his trade that they might choose a silhouette that minimized something dark and vertical, and forgiving something to streamline the line of his hands, sketching in the air the shape of the woman he thought she ought to try to be. Nora had heard this her whole life in 100 voices, and she had learned to swallow it. She swallowed it now. She did not see Damiano in the doorway until he spoke. "No," he said. Fabian turned, all smiles. "Mr. Vitale, I'm only suggesting we flatter the... You're suggesting you hide her." Damiano crossed the room without hurry and stood beside Nora facing the mirror so that the two of them were reflected side by side, and he looked not at Fabian but at Nora's reflection, at the whole of her. Steady. Put her in oxblood, he said. Deep red. Cut it to move. She isn't a problem to be solved down to nothing. She's the reason the rest of the room will forget to breathe. His eyes found hers in the glass. You dress her like an apology, and I'll find a stylist who understands what he's looking at. Fabian Cross was gone by evening, and Nora stood in front of that mirror after everyone left in the deep red silk that moved like water and hid nothing, and asked forgiveness for nothing. And she did not recognize the woman looking back. Not because she was thinner. She was not thinner, she was exactly herself. But because for the first time in her life she was lit. She was the thing the light was for. And she hated that the man who did that for her was the man she had sworn to destroy. That night she almost put down the ledger. She did not, but her hand, she noticed, was less steady on the pen. They married in the rain, in the cathedral, in front of 600 people who came half for the spectacle and half to be seen approving of it. And when the priest asked, and the champagne flute cracked in Camilla Ashford's fist near the back, Nora looked up into Damiano's calm, terrible eyes and said her vow. He said his. His voice did not perform. He held her hand as though it were something he had been given custody of and did not intend to fail. And when he kissed her, a brief restrained press of mouths correct for a cathedral, she felt the leashed weight of him behind it, the enormous held-back tide of a man who did nothing by halves. And she understood with a plunge of fear that whatever game she thought she was playing it against an opponent she did not remotely understand. She moved fully into his world after that, and she began, very quietly, to hunt. She was good at it. She had a bookkeeper's patience and a bookkeeper's invisibility. The family had absorbed her as the wife, decorative and irrelevant, and so no one guarded their words around her the way they'd guard them around a man. She learned the estate's rhythms. She read the mail before Enzo filed it. She sat in the room while Damiano took calls and made herself so still, so ornamental that he forgot she was listening. And she listened, and she wrote it all down, and she waited for the moment the mask would finally slip, and she would hear him in his own voice admit to what he'd done to Thomas. The moment never came. Instead, the case fell apart in her hands. It began with the ledgers. Damiano, it turned out, kept meticulous private books. A paranoid man's insurance, every transaction the family touched recorded in a cipher he clearly believed no outsider could read. But Nora was not an outsider to numbers. She sat up 3 nights with those books, and what she found made the cold machine in her chest grind to a halt, because the Vitale family's records of the loan to Thomas Bennett told a story the world did not know. The loan had been generous, low interest, patient terms, the kind of loan you make to a man you respect. Thomas had been paying it down, on schedule. There was no default, there was no squeeze. There was, on the night Thomas died, no earthly reason for the Vitale family to harm him, because a live Thomas Bennett, paying a healthy loan, was worth far more to them than a dead one. And then she found the other thing, the thing that stopped her heart. Buried in the cipher dated 2 days after Thomas's murder was a single furious entry, not an accounting of money, but of blood, an internal Vitale investigation. Who killed the Bennett kid, and who was letting us take the fall for it? Damiano had not ordered Thomas's death. Damiano had spent the last year secretly tearing his own organization apart trying to find out who had, because someone had murdered a man under Vitale protection and hung the crime around Vitale necks. And to a man like Damiano, that was not a scandal. It was a declaration of war he could not answer, because he did not know who had fired the first shot. Not since, Salvatore had said, he has not slept properly in a year. Not since Thomas Bennett died wearing the Vitale name like a target someone else had painted on him. Nora sat in the dark with the ledger she had built to bury her husband, and she understood that she had spent 3 months hating the wrong man. The realization did not arrive gently. It came like a wall coming down, and under the rubble was a truth she was not ready for. The man she had married to destroy was the only person in the city who wanted Thomas's killer found as badly as she did. She should have gone to him then. She almost did. But there was one loose thread left, the same thread that had come loose in Gerald Thorne's office months before. The holding company, the Cayman shell, the money that moved without paper. She pulled it, and the thread ran, through 3 layers of forged authorization and one very clever hand, straight into the heart of the Vitale family itself. The forgeries were good. Whoever had faked the loan documents to make it look like the Vitales were squeezing Thomas had access to the family's own paper, the family's own seals, the family's own routing. It was an inside job. Someone close, someone trusted, someone with the keys, had murdered Thomas Bennett, dressed the corpse in Vitale colors, and sold the whole stage tableau to a waiting Cesare Bruno, who had spent the year since using the scandal to bleed the Vitale family's allies away and set the 2 houses on a warpath. And Nora, following the money in the small hours while her husband slept, found the hand that had signed the last forgery. It had tried to hide. It had routed itself through 6 accounts and a dead man's name. But numbers behaved for Nora, and at the end of the trail, plain as a fingerprint, was the private cipher mark of Damiano Vitale's most trusted man. His underboss, the one who had run the internal investigation into Thomas's death, the one assigned to find the killer, Renzo Fontana. The killer had been put in charge of the hunt for himself. She had it now, all of it, and she had no one to give it to, because to prove it, she would have to admit she had married her husband to destroy him, and she did not know anymore what he would do with that. She was still deciding when the Brunos moved. They moved because Renzo told them to. Nora would learn later that her quiet hunting had not been quiet enough. That Renzo, watching the wife the way a snake watches a shifting shadow, had seen her at the ledgers one night, too many, and understood that the bookkeeper Damiano had married was pulling the exact thread that would hang him. So, he did what cornered men do. He decided to end it before it ended him, and he reached out to Cesare Bruno, and together they set a trap with 2 jaws. The first jaw closed on Margaret. Nora came back from the specialist follow-up to find the medical wing of the estate in chaos. Her mother's oxygen tampered with, a nurse drugged, and a man who did not belong there, slipping out a service door. Cain, they called him after, when the pieces were assembled. A code name, a ghost. The kind of professional Cesare Bruno kept for exactly this. He had not finished the job. Margaret lived, saved by minutes and by a guard's suspicion. But the message was clear, and it was aimed at Damiano. Your wife is digging. Make her stop, or the next one lands. Renzo delivered the message himself, all wounded loyalty, urging Damiano to send the woman and her sick mother away for their own safety, out of the estate, out from behind the walls, out where Cain could finish what he'd started. Damiano's fury was a still, white, terrible thing. Nora had never seen it turned outward before. It did not shout. It made the whole house quiet. And in the quiet, Nora made a decision, because she was not a woman who could sit behind a wall while men decided her fate. She had never been that woman. She had only for a long time been told she was. She went to Damiano's study that night, and she put her ledger on his desk. Both of them. The one she'd built to bury him, and the one she'd built to save him. And she told him everything. The gala, the plan. The 3 months she had spent hating him for a murder he did not commit. She watched something break open in his face as she talked. Not rage, though she'd braced for rage, but a kind of raw astonishment. The look of a man who has been alone in a truth for a year and has just heard another human being speak it aloud. I married you to destroy you, Nora said, because she would not lie to him. Not now, not with her mother's life on the table. And I was wrong about you, but I wasn't wrong about the numbers. The numbers say Renzo killed my brother. The numbers say Renzo has been selling you to Cesare Bruno the whole time. And the numbers, she turned the ledger, showed him the last forged mark, the cipher only the 2 most trusted men in the family could make. Say he means to end me before I can prove it. Damiano looked at the mark for a long, long time. Then he looked at her, and when he spoke his voice had gone somewhere very cold and very quiet. You found in 3 months, he said, what my whole family couldn't find in a year. Something moved behind his eyes, grief and fury, and under both of them aimed at her, a heat she had been refusing to name. You came into my house to bring me down, and instead you're the only person in the world who ever tried to save me." He stood. He came around the desk. "I have been so alone in this, Nora, that I stopped believing anyone would ever stand on my side of it. And it's you. It's the woman I—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "The woman I never should have let myself want, and wanted anyway." The second jaw of the trap closed that night. Renzo's men, moving on the estate under cover of the manufactured emergency, expecting to find a frightened wife and a distracted boss. What they found was the two of them ready, because a bookkeeper had read the future in a column of numbers and a Mafia boss had believed her. The violence, when it came, was fast and ugly and close. Nora would carry the sound of it the long time. She saw Damiano move for the first time the way the city whispered he could move. No longer still, no longer patient, a man doing terrible arithmetic with his hands. And she understood that everything the city feared about him was true, and that all of it, all of that lethal weight, had rearranged itself in an instant to stand between her mother's door and the men who'd come to kill. But it was Nora who ended it, because Kane, the ghost, the professional, had not come for the guards or the boss. He had come for her, for the woman with the ledger, the only witness who could put it all together. And he came quiet through the medical wing, where he thought a plus-size bookkeeper would be cowering by her mother's bed. She was not cowering. She had spent 3 months in this house learning exactly where everything was, because that was what she did. She learned the rooms, she read the layout the way she read a balance sheet, and she knew that the medical wing's oxygen line ran through a valve in the corridor, and she knew the corridor's lights ran off a single old panel, and she knew that a man who kills in the dark relies on being the only one who can see. She killed the lights. In the black, she was home, and he was lost. She did not have to be stronger than Kane. She only had to be one step ahead of him in a house she'd memorized, and he hadn't, and she was. And the guards Enzo sent found her standing over the ghost with a fire extinguisher in her 2 hands, and her mother safe and breathing behind her. Damiano found her like that, lit by the emergency panel's red glow, chest heaving, unbroken. And the thing that had been building between them the whole cold season finally broke its banks. He crossed the ruined corridor and took her face in his bloodied hands and kissed her the way a drowning man breaks the surface with everything without apology. A kiss that was possession and gratitude and terror, and a year of loneliness ending all at once, and Nora, who had married this man to bury him, who had catalogued his sins in a ledger, who had refused her whole life to be the thing the light was for, kissed him back, and stopped at last pretending she hadn't wanted to. "You were never a hostage in this house," Damiano said against her mouth. "You were the only free thing in it. I just didn't have the word for what you were until now." "And what am I?" she asked. "Mine," he said. "If you'll have it. And God help anyone who forgets it." But wanting each other was not the reckoning. The reckoning came for Renzo Fontana and Cesare Bruno, and Nora insisted that she be in the room when it did. She had not clawed her way from the coat check to the truth to be sent upstairs when the bill came due. Damiano tried, once, to keep her clear of it. She looked at him the way she'd looked at Gerald Thorne on the day he fired her, and she said, "He killed my brother. I built the case. I'll be there when you close it. Or I'll close it myself." And Damiano, who was learning, fast, that his wife could not be minimized any more than a mountain could, inclined his head and made room. They took Renzo first, because a traitor unmasked before his patron is a weapon you can aim. They took him at the family table in front of Salvatore Conti and Enzo Marchetti and Vince Ricci and the whole assembled weight of the house he'd betrayed. Renzo came smiling, loyal Renzo. Right-hand Renzo, ready to counsel Damiano on the tragic necessity of getting rid of the troublesome wife. And Nora rose from her seat, in her ox-blood red, and she laid the ledger on the table, and in her small, exact bookkeeper's voice she read out the numbers. The forged loan, the staged murder scene dressed in Vitale colors, the 6 accounts and the dead man's name, and, at the end of all of it, plain as a signature on a check, the cipher mark only Renzo could make. She did not raise her voice once. She did not have to. Numbers, read aloud in a silent room by a woman who cannot be argued with, are the coldest sound in the world. Renzo's smile came apart by degrees. He tried the things such men try. Denial, then fury, then a lunge for the story that it had all been for the family's own good. Salvatore Conti, ancient and dry, listened to none of it. He only looked at Renzo with the sorrow of a man who has lived long enough to see every kind of betrayal, and he said, "You put a Vitale name on an innocent man's grave to sell us to our enemies. There is no word for you at this table." And the table agreed, in the way that table agreed to things, and Renzo Fontana learned that the mercy he had spent a year denying to others had, in the end, run out for him too. But Nora looked Renzo in the eye first, before any of it. She made him look at her, the overlooked woman, the one he'd thought too soft and too invisible to matter. And she said, "My brother's name was Thomas. He paid his debts, and he told the truth, and he trusted the wrong man to have his back. You're going to say his name back to me now, and then you're going to understand that the person who took everything from you was the person you never once bothered to see." And Renzo, at the end, said Thomas's name. It was the last useful thing he ever did. Cesare Bruno was harder because Cesare had money and lawyers and a public face and had been careful all this time to keep his own hands a county away from the blood. But Nora had spent her career finding the 70,000 hidden inside the $7, and Cesare's careful distance was, to a bookkeeper, just another discrepancy to reconcile. The forged documents Renzo had made carried Cesare's money on their backs. The Cayman shell, the holding company, the interest Cesare had paid to acquire the paper he used to frame the Vitales. It was all there. It had been there since the day Gerald Thorne fired Nora for noticing it. She had simply, at last, followed it home. They did not need to put a bullet in Cesare Bruno. Nora would not have let them, even if they'd wanted to. She'd had enough of the city solving things with holes in warehouse floors. Instead, she did the thing that a man like Cesare feared more than death, the thing he had no defense against, because it came not from an enemy family, but from a paper trail no lawyer could bury. She took her ledger, the whole clean, incontrovertible arithmetic of it, and with Damiano's reach opening every door that mattered, she put it in the hands of a federal prosecutor who had been waiting her entire career for exactly this. Eleanor Prescott, the corrupt district authority who'd looked the other way on Thomas's case in exchange for Bruno money, went down in the same net, her career and her freedom ending in the same paragraph. Cesare Bruno was arrested at his own gala in front of his own photographers, the word philanthropist still wet on the caption when the cuffs went on. He lost the money. He lost the family. He lost the war he'd started and the name he'd built, and the last thing he saw as a free man was a plus-size bookkeeper in oxblood red standing at the edge of the room, watching him fall, entirely unafraid. "You should have looked harder," Nora told him quietly as they took him past. "At the woman holding the coats. At the sister keeping the books. You never look at the ones who see everything." She let that land the way Camilla's cruelty had once landed on her, and then she turned her back on Cesare Bruno and walked away and did not look back, because he was not worth the turn of her head. They married again in the spring, properly this time, not as a pact but as a vow. Two people actually meant. Salvatore Conti presided over the family's blessing with tears in his old dry eyes. Margaret Bennett, her heart mended by the surgeon her son-in-law had quietly paid for, walked her daughter down the aisle on her own 2 feet. Grace Molina caught the flowers and cried and threatened to cater the whole thing herself. Enzo Marchetti, who had told a frightened woman in a narrow hallway that the truth about Damiano was smaller than she thought, stood as a witness and, for once in his blunt life, looked something close to happy. And when the priest asked this time if anyone knew a reason these two should not be joined, the whole vast room was silent. Not the poisoned, held-breath silence of the first wedding, but the silence of a city that had finally learned thoroughly and at great cost what happened to people who crossed the Vitale family and the woman who kept its books. Nora Bennett had not been rescued. She wanted that understood. Later, when people told the story wrong, no one had swept in to save the poor, overlooked girl. She had built her own case in her own hand at her own kitchen table with a stack of medical bills climbing the wall behind her. She had walked into the lion's house on purpose. She had memorized the rooms, followed the money, killed the lights on a killer, and read a traitor's death sentence aloud in her own steady voice. Damiano Vitale had not made her powerful. He had only, at long last, been the first person in her life to see the power that was already there, and to stand beside it rather than in its way. They gave her a name in the city after that. Not the big girl who does the spreadsheets. They called her the Vitale wife, and they said it the way you say the name of weather you'd be a fool to travel in. And they were right to. They spent so long underestimating her that they never saw her coming. And by the time they finally looked, she was already standing on everything they'd tried to take. That is the thing. The cruel ones never learn until it's far too late. The woman you overlook is the one keeping the only ledger that counts, and someday she will read your name aloud. If a fierce, unbreakable heroine is your kind of story, do her the honor of a like. Share this with someone who's been underestimated one too many times, and subscribe so you never miss the moment the overlooked one takes her crown. Tell me in the comments. The second Nora turned to face Camila at that coat check, did you already know she was going to win it all?